The airport terminal buzzed with life. A cacophony of announcements, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversation blending into a relentless din. Claire Bennett, a 65-year-old retired teacher, sat stiffly in an upholstered chair near Gate B12 at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Her suitcase rested at her feet, a well-worn novel in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. The chaos of holiday travelers filled the space. Children tugged on weary parents, businesspeople in sharp suits tapped urgently on their phones, and overburdened airline staff attempted to restore order. Claire sighed heavily, glancing at her watch. The flight to Denver was delayed, another small frustration in an already trying day. She was on her way to a long-anticipated family reunion, her first in years, and had treated herself to a first-class ticket as a rare indulgence. A retired teacher with a modest pension, she'd always been careful with her finances, but she'd reasoned that after decades of molding young minds, she deserved a little luxury. As the boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, Claire gathered her things and made her way to the gate. The airline staff scanned her ticket with a polite smile, and she strode briskly down the jet bridge, eager to settle into the comfort of first class. The cabin's plush seats and extra legroom felt like an oasis compared to the chaos she'd left behind. Just as Claire tucked her carry-on into the overhead compartment, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A young man in a crisp military uniform was making his way down the aisle. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but his presence unsettled Claire. She'd long prided herself on being fair-minded, a quality she'd emphasized in her decades as a teacher. But now, an unkind thought crossed her mind. Must be another free upgrade for the military. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him approach. The name patch on his chest read Matthews. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, nodding toward the seat beside hers. Claire's stomach tightened. Of all the empty seats in the cabin, why did he have to be next to her? She stepped aside with a forced smile, letting him settle in a 3B while she reclaimed her own seat by the window. As she adjusted her scarf, her thoughts churned. I paid full price for this seat. Did he? A flight attendant glided down the aisle, offering pre-departure drinks. When she reached Sergeant Matthews, her face lit up with appreciation. "Thank you for your service," she said warmly. "Can I get you anything?" "It's on us." Claire's annoyance bubbled over. "Don't you ever get tired of people bending over backward for you?" she asked, her tone sharp. Matthews looked up, clearly startled. "Excuse me? All this special treatment," she continued, gesturing toward the flight attendant. "Some of us had to work hard to get here. We didn't have anyone handing us upgrades or freebies." The flight attendant froze, her smile faltering as she glanced uneasily between them. Matthew's expression tightened, but he remained composed. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my best like everyone else. I paid for this seat myself." His calm response only irritated Claire further. She crossed her arms, muttering something under her breath. The flight attendant quickly handed Matthews a glass of water and moved on, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. As the plane began to taxi, Claire stared resolutely out the window, avoiding further interaction. But her mind wasn't at peace. She'd always seen herself as someone who valued fairness and hard work, yet something about Matthew's presence seemed to challenge her assumptions. She felt a mix of irritation and unease, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Matthews, for his part, seemed content to ignore her. He pulled a small photograph from his pocket, studying it with a soft expression. Claire caught a glimpse of the image, a smiling young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, holding a soccer ball. Unable to restrain her curiosity, Claire broke the silence. "Cute kid. Your daughter?" she asked, her tone cooler than she intended. Matthews nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Her name's Emily." "Must be nice," Claire said flatly, "having a family waiting for you." Matthews turned to her, his gaze steady. "It is," he said simply, though a flicker of sadness crossed his face. He tucked the photo back into his pocket and turned his attention to the in-flight safety demonstration. Claire shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence faltering. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, the young soldier's quiet dignity unsettled her. She had been prepared to write him off as entitled or unworthy, but now she wasn't so sure. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Claire found herself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps her assumptions weren't as fair-minded as she'd always believed. The soft hum of the hotel air conditioner provided a backdrop to Claire's quiet morning routine. Sunlight streamed through the partially drawn curtains of her room, illuminating her open suitcase on the bed. She'd arrived the night before, tired but excited about the family reunion that awaited her. Claire sipped her tea as she scrolled through her tablet, catching up on emails and news. She'd planned a leisurely morning before heading out to meet her relatives. A headline on the local news app caught her eye. Local soldier's daughter fights for her life. Community rallies for support. Claire tapped the link out of idle curiosity. The accompanying image loaded first. A young girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile clutching a teddy bear. Beneath it, the name Emily Matthews was written. Claire's breath caught as she recognized the surname. As she read, her heart sank. The article detailed the story of Sergeant David Matthews, the same man she'd clashed with on the plane the day before. Emily, his 9-year-old daughter, was battling a rare and life-threatening heart condition. The piece explained that despite David's military insurance, the specialized surgery Emily needed wasn't fully covered. To bridge the financial gap, David had started a modest fundraiser, hoping to gather enough support from the community. Claire's mind flashed back to the moment on the plane when David had pulled out the photograph. That must have been Emily. She remembered her dismissive tone, her unkind assumptions about him, and the way she'd brushed off his quiet dignity. She stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The article painted a picture of a devoted father doing everything he could to save his daughter's life. It described how David had taken on extra duties during his deployment to save money and how he'd returned home early on emergency leave when Emily's condition worsened. The guilt began to gnaw at her. She'd spent the entire flight focused on her own frustrations, blind to the reality of the man sitting beside her. He wasn't some opportunist angling for special treatment. He was a father fighting against impossible odds. The image of Emily, so full of life despite her condition, tugged at something deep within Claire. The article included a link to the fundraiser David had set up. Out of curiosity, Claire clicked on it. The page was simple but heartfelt, with a photograph of Emily playing soccer before her illness and a message from David explaining their situation. Emily is the light of my life. She's smart, funny, and braver than I could ever hope to be. We're asking for help because we've exhausted all our options. Any contribution, no matter how small, will go toward giving her the chance she deserves. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Claire felt a lump form in her throat as she read the comments below. Dozens of strangers had left words of encouragement alongside their donations. Some gave $10, others $100, all expressing their hopes for Emily's recovery. The total raised so far was a little over $15,000, a fraction of the $150,000 goal. She set the tablet down and stared out the window. The Atlanta skyline stretched before her, a sprawling tapestry of ambition and opportunity. Yet, in this moment, all she could think about was Emily and the father who had sat silently beside her, enduring her cutting remarks. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. She'd always prided herself on being a good person, someone who championed fairness and kindness. But her actions on that plane told a different story. She judged David without knowing him, assuming the worst and treating him unfairly. For the first time in years, Claire found herself questioning not just her actions, but the beliefs that had shaped them. She thought of her years as a teacher, the lessons she tried to impart to her students about empathy and understanding. How had she drifted so far from those values? Determined to make amends, Claire picked up her tablet again. She stared at the donation field on the fundraiser page, hesitating for only a moment before typing in a significant number, $5,000. Her finger hovered over the donate button as doubt crept in. Would it matter? Could money ever undo the harm she'd caused? With a deep breath, she pressed the button. A confirmation message appeared on the screen, thanking her for her generosity. But Claire felt no relief, only a gnawing sense that this was merely a first step. As she prepared for the day ahead, Claire resolved to do more. She didn't yet know what form her actions would take, but she was determined to face the discomfort she'd been avoiding. Emily's story had opened a door she couldn't close. And for the first time in a long while, Claire felt the stirrings of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The rhythmic hum of Claire's car blended with the sound of her heart pounding in her chest. She'd spent the better part of the morning debating whether to follow through on her decision. The article about Emily had left her shaken, and the anonymous donation she'd made to David's fundraiser had done little to ease the weight pressing on her conscience. But it wasn't enough. Claire knew that now. The memory of David's calm, stoic demeanor on the plane contrasted starkly with the depth of his personal struggle. And the image of Emily's bright, hopeful smile lingered in her mind, tugging at her resolve. The hospital loomed ahead, a modern building of glass and steel. Claire parked her car, took a deep breath, and made her way inside. The pediatric ICU was on the third floor, a quiet space filled with muted tones and the faint beeping of monitors. Children's artwork adorned the walls, their cheerful colors clashing with the somber reality of the unit. Claire hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place in her tailored coat and polished shoes. She spotted the nurse's station and approached cautiously. "Excuse me," she began, her voice quieter than she'd intended. "I'm looking for Emily Matthews. Her father is Sergeant David Matthews." The nurse looked up, her expression professional but warm. "Are you family?" Claire's cheeks flushed. "No, just a friend," she said hesitantly, realizing how hollow the word sounded. The nurse hesitated before gesturing down the hall. "Room 312. He's with her now." Summoning her courage, Claire walked slowly toward the room. Through the small glass window in the door, she saw David sitting beside Emily's bed. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands rested on his knees. Emily lay motionless, her small frame surrounded by wires and monitors. Her face, though pale, still held a trace of the bright spirit Claire had seen in the photo. She knocked softly on the doorframe, her heart hammering. David turned, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. "Mrs. Bennett?" he asked, standing quickly. His tone was cautious, his expression unreadable. Claire's throat tightened. She took a small step into the room. "I read about Emily," she began, her voice trembling. "I wanted to help, and I owe you an apology." David's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, he nodded. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside to make room. Claire entered, her gaze immediately drawn to Emily. Up close, the fragility of the young girl was even more striking. She was impossibly small beneath the hospital blankets, her dark curls fanned out on the pillow. Yet even in her stillness, there was something undeniably strong about her. David pulled a chair from the corner, offering it to Claire. She sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I'm sorry for how I treated you on the plane," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I made assumptions about you that were unfair and unkind. I'm ashamed of how I acted." David's expression softened, though a trace of wariness remained. He sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'll admit, I didn't expect to see you here," he said slowly. "But I appreciate you saying that. It means something." Claire nodded, her eyes darting to Emily. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "I can see how much she means to you." David's gaze shifted to his daughter, his face softening. "She's my everything," he said simply. "I'd do anything for her." For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of medical equipment filling the room. Claire cleared her throat. "I made a donation to your fundraiser," she admitted, "but it didn't feel like enough. I want to do more if you'll let me." David raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "More? I can help with organizing, making calls, whatever you need," Claire said earnestly. I have time, and I want to make things right." David studied her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll take you up on that." A sense of relief washed over Claire. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was determined to see it through. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Claire soon became a fixture at the hospital, her daily visits bringing a sense of warmth and consistency to the otherwise clinical environment of the pediatric ICU. Every morning, She arrived with a new item tucked under her arm, a storybook, a set of colorful puzzles, or a stuffed animal she thought might coax a smile from Emily. At first, the young girl had been shy, retreating behind her father's presence or the array of monitors surrounding her. But over time, Emily's cautious curiosity grew into open affection for Claire. "Do you want to hear the rest of the story?" Claire asked one afternoon, holding up a dog-eared copy of *Anne of Green Gables. Emily's eyes sparkled as she nodded. "Yes, please. I want to know if Anne gets to stay at Green Gables." Claire smiled, her heart swelling at the sound of Emily's eager voice. Moments like these were why she kept coming back. It wasn't just about making amends anymore. It was about being there for Emily and David in their time of need. Over the weeks, Claire also began to notice the strain on David. The man seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, juggling his responsibilities as a single parent, his job, and the labyrinthine challenges of Emily's medical care. One day, as they sat together in the hospital cafeteria, Claire brought it up. "You look exhausted," she said gently, pushing a cup of coffee across the table toward him. "How are you holding up?" David gave her a tired smile. "I've been better," he admitted. "Between fighting with insurance, keeping up with work remotely, and trying to be here for Emily, it's a lot." Claire's brows knit together. "Is there anything I can do to help?" David hesitated, his pride warring with his gratitude. Finally, he sighed. "Honestly, the insurance paperwork is a nightmare. I'm not even sure I'm doing it right half the time. And trying to coordinate with specialists, it feels like I'm hitting a wall every day." Claire's teacher instincts kicked in. "Let me take a look at it," she said firmly. "I'm good with paperwork, and I have a few connections that might help." David hesitated again, then nodded. "All right. Thank you, Claire. I don't know what I'd do without you." Claire threw herself into the task with the same determination she'd once applied to helping struggling students. She pored over the insurance documents, flagging errors and inconsistencies, and spent hours on the phone advocating for Emily's case. She even reached out to a former colleague whose brother worked in hospital administration, hoping to cut through some of the red tape. Her persistence paid off. Within a week, she'd secured a meeting with Dr. Caroline Hart, a renowned pediatric heart surgeon who specialized in Emily's condition. Dr. Hart's schedule was booked months in advance, but after hearing Claire's impassioned plea and reviewing Emily's case, she agreed to prioritize the surgery. When Claire shared the news with David, his reaction was a mixture of disbelief and relief. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do this, but it means the world to us." "You don't need to thank me," Claire replied, her own voice trembling. "I'm just glad I could help." In the days leading up to the surgery, Claire's bond with Emily deepened. They spent hours together, painting pictures, reading stories, and playing board games. Emily, who had once been quiet and reserved, now greeted Claire with hugs and laughter. The young girl's resilience inspired Claire, reminding her of the strength she'd seen in so many of her students over the years. Meanwhile, Claire continued to support David in any way she could. She organized a meal train for him, enlisting the help of hospital volunteers and local church groups to ensure he had home-cooked meals during Emily's recovery. She also helped him draft emails to his commanding officer, requesting additional leave time to stay by Emily's side. The night before the surgery, David and Claire sat together in the hospital's family lounge. Emily was asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily beneath a patchwork quilt someone had donated. "I've been thinking about what you said," David began, breaking the comfortable silence, "about wanting to do more. I'm not used to relying on people, but you've gone above and beyond for us. I just want you to know how much it means to me." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "You and Emily have given me more than I could ever give you," she said softly. "Helping you has reminded me of what really matters." David reached across the table, giving her hand a firm, grateful squeeze. "Well, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you're here." As the hours ticked by, Claire stayed by David's side, offering quiet reassurance. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Together, they were building a bridge over the chasm of uncertainty, one step at a time. The hospital lounge was eerily quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes and the distant beep of monitors. Claire sat beside David, both of them clutching lukewarm cups of coffee that neither intended to finish. The hours stretched on, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them as they waited for news of Emily's surgery. David's hands fidgeted with his phone, though he hadn't checked it in over an hour. Claire reached out, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "She's in good hands," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of her own nerves. David nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the double doors at the end of the hallway. "I know. It's just waiting is the hardest part." Claire didn't need to respond. She simply stayed by his side, a quiet pillar of support. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors swung open. Dr. Hart, the renowned surgeon who had taken on Emily's case, walked toward them. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and exhaustion lined her face, but she wore a small, reassuring smile. "The surgery went well," she announced. "We were able to repair the defect, and Emily responded beautifully. She'll need close monitoring and follow-up care, but I'm very optimistic about her recovery." David exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Claire felt tears prick her eyes as a wave of gratitude washed over her. She turned to David, her hand still on his arm. "She's going to be okay," she whispered, her own voice trembling. The days following the surgery were a blur of cautious optimism and steady progress. Emily's room in the pediatric ward became a haven of hope and activity. Claire brought books and puzzles, filling the hours with stories and games to distract Emily from the discomfort of recovery. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Emily asked one afternoon, her voice soft but curious. Claire smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "I think so," she replied. "I loved helping people learn, watching them discover things they didn't think they could do. And now I guess I'm still teaching in my own way." Emily nodded thoughtfully, a small smile curling her lips. "You're a good teacher, Miss Claire." Claire's heart swelled. "And you're a very good student," she said, leaning down to kiss Emily's forehead. As Emily's strength returned, she began taking small steps around the ward, her determination inspiring everyone who watched. David often joined them, his pride evident as he cheered Emily on during her physical therapy sessions. "You're doing amazing, sweetheart," he told her one day, his voice brimming with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Claire's presence became an integral part of their routine. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was family. News of Emily's successful surgery began to spread, amplified by the hospital's social media page and the local press. Reporters highlighted the community's support and the extraordinary efforts of people like Claire. But as the spotlight grew, so did the conversations about the systemic issues David had faced. "The military takes care of its own," one article began, "but gaps in healthcare coverage leave families like the Matthewses vulnerable." Claire read the piece with a mix of pride and indignation. She knew this was an opportunity to push for change. With David's blessing, she began writing op-eds and giving interviews, sharing their story to advocate for improved healthcare for military families. "These brave men and women serve our country," she wrote in one article, "but when their children need life-saving care, they're often left to fend for themselves. It's unacceptable, and we have to do better." Her words resonated. Local politicians reached out, promising to review policies. Nonprofits began organizing additional support for families in similar situations. Donations to Emily's fundraiser surged, exceeding its goal and allowing David to focus solely on Emily's recovery without financial worry. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's health continued to improve. Her laughter filled the hospital halls, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Claire found herself reflecting on how much her own life had changed since that fateful flight. She'd started this journey out of guilt, driven by a desire to make amends. But somewhere along the way, it had become about so much more. David and Emily had shown her the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the importance of stepping outside her comfort zone. One evening, as the three of them sat together in Emily's room, Claire turned to David. "I never expected any of this when I got on that plane," she said. "But I'm so glad it happened. You and Emily have changed my life." David smiled, his eyes warm. "You've changed ours too, Claire. More than you'll ever know." As Emily drifted off to sleep, her small hand clutching Claire's, Claire realized that this was the most meaningful chapter of her life. She hadn't just helped a family in need. She'd found a new purpose, one rooted in compassion and connection. Together, they had bridged a gap that once seemed insurmountable, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could create life-changing outcomes. The early summer breeze carried the sound of laughter through the modest backyard of David's home. Emily's giggles rang out as she chased a group of neighborhood children, her bright pink sneakers flashing in the late afternoon sunlight. Her energy was a far cry from the frail, quiet girl Claire had met months ago in the hospital. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and Claire felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched Emily's joy unfold. The celebration was small but heartfelt. Friends, neighbors, and members of the local community had gathered to mark Emily's recovery. Colorful streamers swayed in the breeze, and a picnic table laden with potluck dishes sat at the center of the yard. Claire found herself drawn into conversations with people who had come to admire her efforts in helping the Matthews family. "You've done so much for them," one woman said, handing Claire a plate of barbecue. "It's inspiring to see how far Emily has come. She's a little miracle." Claire smiled warmly, accepting the plate. "She's the miracle," she replied. "I just gave a little nudge." From across the yard, David caught her eye. He excused himself from a conversation and walked over, his expression earnest. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Claire nodded, setting her plate aside. He led her to a quieter corner of the yard, away from the crowd. "I've been trying to find the right words," David said, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "But everything feels so inadequate. You didn't just help us, Claire. You gave us hope when we didn't think there was any left. You changed our lives. I'll never forget it." Claire placed a hand on his arm, her own eyes misting over. "No, David," she said softly. "You and Emily changed mine. You reminded me of what really matters in life. I'll always be grateful for that." The two shared a moment of quiet understanding, the weight of their shared journey hanging in the air. Then, as if on cue, Emily's voice called out, "Miss Claire, come play with us." Claire laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Duty calls," she said, giving David a pat on the shoulder before walking toward Emily. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm, golden glow, Claire found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. What had started as a moment of prejudice and irritation on a plane had blossomed into a life-altering journey of growth, compassion, and connection. She thought back to that flight, to her dismissive remarks and the cold assumptions she'd made about David. The shame of that moment still lingered, but it was overshadowed by the pride she felt in the person she had become. David and Emily had shown her the transformative power of empathy, and the experience had opened her heart in ways she hadn't thought possible. Claire's advocacy work had only just begun. Inspired by Emily's story, she had taken her fight to improve military health care to new heights. Her op-eds had sparked conversations, and her speeches at local events had drawn attention to the systemic gaps that left families like the Matthewses struggling. She'd even started working with a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military families, channeling her energy into creating real, tangible change. The ripple effects of her efforts were already visible. Donations to similar fundraisers had increased, and local policymakers were beginning to take notice. Claire knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt truly fulfilled. As the evening wound down, the crowd began to disperse, leaving only a few close friends and family behind. Emily sat on the porch steps, her cheeks flushed from playing, her eyes drooping with the telltale signs of an impending bedtime. Claire joined her, sitting down with a sigh. "Did you have fun today, sweetheart?" she asked. Emily nodded, leaning her head against Claire's arm. "The best day ever," she murmured sleepily. Claire wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "You got a lot more of those ahead of you," she said softly. David appeared in the doorway, a grateful smile on his face as he watched the two of them. "Thank you, Claire," he said quietly. "For everything." Claire looked up, her heart full. "Thank you, David, for letting me be part of your family." As the stars began to twinkle above, Claire knew this was just the beginning. She'd stumbled onto this path by chance, but it had become the most meaningful journey of her life. Emily's laughter, David's gratitude, and the community's support were all reminders of what could be accomplished when people came together with open hearts. Her story wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about purpose. And as she sat on that porch, holding the hand of a little girl who had fought so hard to live, Claire resolved to keep fighting too. For Emily, for David, and for all the families still waiting for their own miracles.